These days, a big trend in music production is making digital sounds feel more organic and basically less perfect, which is quite a contrast to when everyone was chasing pristine recordings and tight timing back in the day. But with the explosion of lo-fi plugins and sample packs, it's clear we crave character and imperfections. So in this video, I'm gonna show you how to add movement, texture and grit to your music using resampling, creative effects and a few extra clever tricks. As usual, you can find all the stems and sounds that I used in this video on my Patreon alongside full track breakdowns, where I go into the tiniest detail on how I create, mix and master my music. So let's hit that subscribe button and jump into Ableton Live. Alright, so in order to showcase today's techniques, I've prepared a little drum beat. Let's take a listen to how it sounds. I'll run through the layers real quick. So we've got a kick drum, then a layered snare, a closed and open hi-hat, a small clicky hat, some chopped up noise and a percussion hit, and then lastly a little drum roll. Now, it's not a bad drum beat, it's a decent down-tempo groove, but it feels a bit static and it lacks character at the moment. So we're gonna add in some texture and bring in a more human, organic vibe, and we'll start by focusing on the kick drum. Now, at the moment, every kick drum hits at the exact same volume or velocity, which makes the groove feel a little rigid, and a real drummer wouldn't hit every kick at the same velocity either. But instead of manually lowering the velocity on a few kicks, which would still leave us with a repeating 4-bar loop, we'll use a deviation tool to subtly vary the velocity of the selected kicks throughout the entire track, which will add natural movement and feel. Now, if you're not familiar with the deviation tool, it basically allows you to introduce variation to the velocity within a range that we can define. So right now our kicks are set to a velocity of 100, and if we add a deviation of -16, each affected kick will randomly play at a velocity between 100 and 100 minus 16, which is 84. Now, to keep the groove grounded and not overly random, we'll only apply the deviation to just a few kicks and we'll leave the other ones at 100. And as you can hear, this has made our kick drum pattern slightly less rigid and mechanical. Now let's move on to the snare. I'll turn this 1-bar loop into a 2-bar loop and then nudge the snares around slightly off grid. You can get as wonky here as you like, but I'm gonna keep it fairly subtle for a more natural feel. I've also got a couple of claps that I will layer with the snare. Let's add them in. And also here I'll slightly offset each clap so that every snare clap combo sounds a little different throughout this loop. Let's listen to what we have so far. It's definitely already starting to sound a little more dynamic. Now, the last clap that I added to the drum rack has this cool kind of reversed onset to it, so let's isolate it and add it right before the last snare to give it a sense of urgency. Now there's a couple of cool things that we can do to make the hi-hats move too. Let's find our hi-hats audio file in the browser and add it to a new audio track. We'll consolidate it, including a tiny bit of silence, into a new file using Command J, and then swap out the old hi-hat for the new one in the sampler. Now the sampler device has a lot more controls than the simpler, so let's change the simpler to a sampler, and we'll unmap the velocity from the volume by setting it to 0%. If we dive into the MIDI tab, we're presented with a list of MIDI data that we can map to several parameters. Now let's map the velocity handles to the sample offset and set it to 100%. The velocity handles in our hi-hat's MIDI clip now control the starting point of our hi-hat sample. Pretty cool. We can now use the velocity deviation on our hi-hat samples to make it start from a slightly different point for each hit. Let's hear it in action. The length and the timing of the hi-hat will now vary slightly and randomly throughout the entire song. Let's do a similar thing to the pitch of the hi-hat using the built-in LFO in our sampler. For this, we'll head over to the modulation tab and use built-in LFO 1. By setting retrigger to off, the LFO won't restart with every hit, and we'll set the LFO to 8th notes and select a random waveform. We can now control to what degree the LFO modulates the 4 parameters at the bottom. Modulating the pitch of the hi-hat 100% is a bit too much for my taste, so let's take it down to around 13. We can also modulate the panning of the hi-hat, so let's set this to around 10 for some slight stereo movement around the center. Sweet, let's take a listen to how it's shaping up so far. Actually, let's give the hi-hat a little more volume. Definitely an improvement on the groove front, but we can make the drums even more interesting by adding some texture. So let's have a look. Now the first thing I'm gonna do is record some Foley from objects that I have laying around the studio. If you don't have a mic or don't feel like spending time recording stuff, you can obviously use samples here too. Now let's add our recording to a simpler device, and as we'll be using this more as a textural layer rather than an individual hit, I'm gonna look for a section that has a pretty consistent volume. I'm also gonna use the built-in filter to filter out everything but the high end. A glue compressor with a super fast attack and release will even out the recording even more. Now, my plan here is to layer each snare with our Foley recording, and while we could manually place small pieces of the Foley over each snare hit, a more efficient and flexible way is to use a MIDI clip and sidechain it with a gate to trigger from the original snare. Let's fine-tune our gate a bit. Now at this point every Foley hit will be identical, but we can easily change it up by using an LFO to automate the starting point of our sampler. To add variation to the Foley throughout the entire track, it's best to use a random LFO, set to change every 2 beats. This will keep the texture dynamic and interesting. As you can see and hear, the Foley now triggers from a different starting point for each snare hit. Let's add the Foley layer to our drum group so the same processing gets applied, and listen to it combined with the snare. Very nice and crunchy. Now let's hear it in context. Alright, we're really making progress here. The drums are sounding much more alive, dynamic, and textural. Now, instead of just using the Foley as audio, we can take it a step further by extracting rhythms from it, unique patterns that we probably couldn't program ourselves. To do this, I'll start by selecting a section of our recording with plenty of peaks or transients, and layer it over our drum beat. Next, I'll enable warp in beats mode and set preserve transients to the little forward arrow, which means loop off, ensuring each transient only plays once and then stops without looping. Finally, I'll shorten the transient envelope to make each hit extremely short. You can hear that Ableton Live is now playing a very short hit for each transient marker it has automatically detected in our Foley recording. These transient markers are shown as a small gray triangles in the audio clips. Let's freeze and flatten our track so we can see what's actually going on here. This is a pretty cool loop in itself, but let's swap it out for another sound. We can easily do this by right-clicking on the audio clip and selecting Extract Groove. The MIDI clip with the groove we just extracted is now available in the groove pool on the left. So let's add it to a MIDI channel and we'll use a sampler to trigger a sample of our choice. We've already got plenty of Foley sounds in this beat now, so to create some contrast, I'm gonna go for a synthetic sound, such as a hi-hat from an 808 drum machine. Let's crop out the first hat from this loop. The MIDI clip is obviously a couple of octaves too low, but we can easily fix this with the pitch MIDI clip. Now the velocities of the hi-hats that Ableton detected while extracting the groove are all over the place, but instead of tweaking each velocity handle manually, we can use the velocity MIDI effect to quickly set a consistent range for the hi-hats to operate in. Using the out low and out high dials, we can define the minimum and maximum velocities for super precise control. So now the groove is still there, but the velocities are kept a bit more in check. The hi-hat is sounding a little sharp and a little long for what I had in mind, so I'm gonna fine-tune it just a bit. Let's rename it and add it to our drum group. It's sounding pretty good, but a little too random maybe, so I'm gonna copy over the first beat to the other bars of the loop, and then I'll hit Command J to consolidate it. I like the groove, but it's sounding a little disconnected from the other drum parts, so I'm gonna use a sidechain compressor to compress it to the kick and make it groove along. Nice. One last thing I'm gonna do to spice up the hi-hats a little is automate the transposition of the hi-hat sample. Alright, now as a final touch to our drums, I'm gonna create some kind of open hi-hat from the paper crumbling we recorded. Let's use an EQ to filter out everything but the very high end. A glue compressor with a fast attack and fast release will even out the dynamics of the paper a bit more. And then I'll use a gate to have it triggered by the raw hats. And then finally, I'm going to use an auto pan to make it move from the left to the right and give our drums a bit more of a stereo feel. Sweet, now let's move it into our drum group, give it an appropriate name, and listen to the entire drum section we have so far. By the way, if you're into the kind of sounds I'm using here, you can go grab my sample packs on TrackClip, Lander, Bandcamp, or in my Patreon shop. Perfect for filling up your library with fresh inspiration. Cool, now with the drums in place, let's start working on some melodic stuff. I've got a piano MIDI clip that I recycled from another session. Let's have a listen. I'm using a stock piano sound here and it sounds great, but it could use a bit more width. Now, typically when recording instruments and aiming for a wide sound, the go-to method is double tracking. This means recording the part twice, panning one take to the left and the other one to the right, which creates a very wide stereo image. Let's apply this concept to our MIDI piano. We're going to duplicate the piano channel twice and pan each one in opposite directions. We'll keep the original piano layer as a reference so we can compare the results later on. I'll also group the two piano channels to easily adjust the overall volume while maintaining their balance. Now, at this point, if we listen, there won't be much of a difference because both piano layers are playing the exact same notes at the same velocities and the same timing. So even when panning them, they essentially sum back to the center, just at a louder volume. So aside from the volume increase, not much of a change there, but let me show you a cool trick. We're gonna head over to the groove library and add a random groove to each of the piano MIDI clips. It doesn't matter which presets you choose, but the key is to apply a different groove to each clip. I personally like to rename the grooves to keep everything organized and easy to follow, and so that I can see what's going on whenever I open the project at a later time. Now, the timing and velocity parameters determine how much the timing and velocity of this particular groove pattern will influence the clip. Since we're not interested in using those here, we'll set them to 0. Instead, we're going to focus on the random parameter. By increasing this, we can introduce subtle timing fluctuations to the clips. Let's set these to around 30% for each clip. Now, again, I want to emphasize the importance of having a different groove with its own randomness for each clip. If we had applied the same groove to both clips, adjusting the randomness would have made both piano clips random in the same way, and they would still sound identical. Now, let's listen to the effect this has on the width of our piano loop. It's clearly already sounding a bit wider. Now, just like a pianist who doesn't hit the keys with the exact same force when playing the same loop twice, we need to make sure the velocity of the notes in both piano clips varies slightly. We can easily achieve this by adding the velocity MIDI effect to both channels and introducing a bit of randomness on every track. A value of around 10 will do. Let's hear it in effect. With the random timing and velocity adjustments, the loop now sounds wide, but in a very natural way. Far more natural than any stereo widening plugin could ever achieve. These plugins typically use phase shifting to create width, which can often result in a thin, spacey sound, for lack of a better word. Now let's compare it to the original piano so we can hear the difference. The last thing I'm gonna do is sidechain it to the kick to give the piano some movement. Cool, now let's add some texture to the piano and make it sound a little older by introducing some tape hiss. Now, typically we could make the tape hiss follow the piano's volume envelope by adding a gate to the tape hiss channel and then routing the piano to its sidechain input. But this time I'm going to use a different approach and use a very cool little device aptly called Texture by a developer named Elephant. Let's place the device right before the compressor on our piano group. Texture lets you drop a texture sample directly into its interface, which then dynamically follows the volume of the channel it's placed on. You can tweak various parameters like looping options and pitch, and there's even 2 built-in filters. The most important controls, however, are the rise and fall parameters, which determine how the imported sample responds to the instrument's dynamics. I'm gonna grab a tape noise sound from one of my packs and drop it in the device. Let's solo the piano and tweak the parameters. I'll reduce the volume of the texture, apply a high-pass filter to eliminate any potential low-end rumble, and increase the fall time for a smoother volume envelope. Let's hear it in action in the context of the track. In hindsight, I'm gonna increase the volume of the texture just a bit. Right now, the piano and drums are sounding a bit dry, so let's fix that. Personally, I'm a big fan of spring reverbs. I actually have quite a few hardware and pedal spring reverbs, though I know they can be divisive. Some people find them way too twangy or too Texas. I love them because aside from adding space and dimension, they also bring a unique character that's hard to replicate with a regular reverb. I'm gonna add a hybrid reverb preset called Spring Parade to the piano group, and then I'll add it to an audio effect track so we can use it in parallel. I'll set the blend control all the way to the left so we're not hearing anything of the algorithmic reverb and just hearing the convolution reverb, which is the spring in this case. Next, we'll set the stereo control all the way to 0, so we're turning the reverb to a mono signal here. And I'm doing this because the piano already sounds very wide and I want to use the spring reverb as a textural layer to fill up the center of the piano's stereo field. I filtered out some low mids because springs can get pretty nasty in that range. Now let's blend it into taste. I absolutely love how the spring reverb almost adds an extra droning note to the piano chords and creates this very soundscapey, slightly eerie vibe that brings a lot of character and mood to the loop. This is something a regular reverb probably couldn't have achieved, so props to the springs for delivering the magic, once again. Now let's add some of this magic to the drums too by copying over the audio effect rack. Oops, let's solo the drums real quick. This awesome stereo spring mode sounds a little too cartoonish, so let's go for the less awesome but more realistic Space Echo spring mode. And we'll also dial down on the feedback a little to make it less metallic sounding. Now let's mix it in with the dry drums. With these types of spatial effects, I like to mix them in until they feel a little too overpowering and then dial them back just slightly. The goal for me is to reach a point where you don't consciously notice the reverb, but once you mute it, you're like, something's gone here. Alright, that's a wrap for part 1. Next week in part 2, we're gonna dive into dynamic bass textures, generative synth plucks, and lush delay. So be sure to subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss out. Cheers!